On the evening of what would have been Virginia Hartwell's 42nd wedding anniversary, her stepson Derek handed her coat across the dining room table and pointed toward the front door. "You've stayed long enough," he said. For a moment, no one moved. Virginia looked at Harold's empty chair at the head of the table, the chair her husband had occupied for 28 years of anniversary dinners. Then she looked at Derek's hand still holding out her coat, as if she were no longer his father's wife, but an unwanted guest. She did not argue. She took the coat slowly with the quiet dignity of a woman who had survived too much to beg for a place at a table built by the man she loved. But as Virginia walked toward the door, she saw something on the sideboard that made her stop. Harold's rosewood box was open. For 40 years that box had remained locked. Virginia had never seen its contents, not once. But now the lid was raised, the old cards inside scattered carelessly, as if someone had searched it in a hurry and missed what mattered most. Then she remembered the only thing Harold had ever told her about that box. "If it is ever opened without you," he had whispered years ago, "read everything inside before you leave." Virginia turned back toward the sideboard. Derek sighed behind her. "What are you doing?" Virginia did not answer, because tucked beneath the anniversary cards was a folded page from Harold's will, and one clause his children had never known existed. The table was set for 12. Virginia had known it would be. She had driven to the house on Elmwood the way she had driven there 1,000 times over 28 years. The familiar turns, the elm trees, arching over the road in their October colors, the particular quality of the evening light in autumn that Harold had always called the most honest light of the year, the light that shows you things as they are rather than as you wish they were. She had known before she arrived that something would be different. Derek had called the dinner a family memorial gathering when he phoned to invite her, and she had heard the word family in the way he used it as a category, with specific membership, and an implication about where she stood in relation to that membership. She had come anyway because Harold had started this dinner 28 years ago, and she had sat beside him at every one of them, and she was not ready, not yet, to let it become something she stayed away from. She found her name card at the far end of the table. She stood and looked at it for a moment. The card was written in a hand she didn't recognize. Not Harold's, not the cursive she had seen on 28 years of anniversary menus, just a printed name placed at the end seat, the seat furthest from the head of the table, the seat that at a formal dinner is understood by everyone present to belong to the person of least significance. She sat down. To Harold's right, the seat she had occupied for 28 years, the seat closest to him, the seat from which she had watched him stand and tap his glass and say the same thing every year in the slightly different way of a man who has found words he believes and is not tired of them, sat a man she had met once before. Pamela's new boyfriend. He was eating the bread rolls with the easy comfort of someone who has been told this is his place and has no reason to question it. The place card in front of him read, "Reserved Derek Jr." Virginia looked at it for a moment. Derek Jr. was 7 years old. He was not at the dinner. His name had been placed in that seat, Harold's seat to Harold's right, the seat of the person Harold had always seated closest to himself as a statement, not for the child's benefit, for hers. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the table. Derek stood at the head of the table to give the tribute. He had prepared remarks. She could tell from the way he held his phone, not speaking from it, but glancing at it occasionally the way people glance at a safety net they have prepared even when they intend to perform without it. He spoke about Harold's business acumen, his commitment to the family legacy, his vision for the Hartwell name. He spoke about what Harold had built and what that building meant to the people in this room. He did not say Virginia's name once. Not once in 4 minutes of tribute to a man she had been married to for 28 years, with whom she had shared a house and a bed and a breakfast table and the particular daily fabric of a long marriage, not one reference to her existence in his life, not one acknowledgement that she was sitting 12 feet away at the far end of the table that Harold had set for her every year for 28 years. She listened to all of it with her hands folded and her expression composed, the way she had learned to be composed in rooms that were trying to tell her she was not there. Pamela spoke next without standing from her seat, in the casual tone of someone making an announcement at a meeting she is already running. She said she had been thinking about the house and its interior, and that she had some ideas she was excited to share with the family about reimagining the main rooms. She used the word reimagining 3 times. She spoke about the sitting room and the upstairs hallway, and the garden-facing bedroom with the confidence of a woman describing spaces that already belonged to her in a voice that did not leave room for the possibility that they did not. Virginia looked at Cassie. Pamela's daughter was sitting across the table, slightly down from Virginia, close enough for a quiet exchange. She was 26 with her father's dark eyes and a quality of attentiveness that did not match the rest of the room she was watching, rather than performing, listening rather than speaking, and when her eyes met Virginia's, she did something no one else at the table had done. She mouthed, "I'm sorry." Virginia gave her a small nod. Just a small one. The kind that says, "I see you and I appreciate it, and we do not need to make this bigger than it is." Derek appeared at her elbow. She had not heard him come around the table. He was simply there suddenly in the way of a man who has made a decision and is executing it before second thoughts can arrive. He had her coat over his arm. The coat she had left on the entry hall rack when she arrived, the gray wool one she had owned for years, the one Harold had always said suited her. Derek said, "Virginia, I think you'd be more comfortable at home. This is really a family evening." He said it quietly. That was the thing she would remember later, not that it was loud, not that it was theatrical, but that it was quiet and matter-of-fact. The way you say something you have already decided requires no discussion. Not cruel enough to be a villain in a story, just ordinary enough to be devastating. 12 people at the table. 12 people who heard it. Some of them looked at their plates. One of the men across from her refilled his wine glass. Pamela adjusted her napkin. Cassie looked at Virginia with an expression that was not performance. It was the real face of a young woman who is ashamed of what she is watching and does not know what to do about it. Virginia stood. She took the coat from Derek's arm. She put it on one sleeve and then the other with the unhurried deliberateness of a woman who will not be rushed in her own departure, who will exit on her own terms even when the exit is not her choice. She smoothed the front of it. She picked up her small bag from the back of the chair. She did not cry. She had decided that in the first moment when she saw her name at the end of the table, she had made the decision the way you make certain decisions not consciously, but with the whole of yourself as a settled fact. She would not give this room her tears. Harold had told her once in a different context that dignity wasn't something people gave you. She had understood him then. She understood him completely now. She walked toward the door. She passed the sideboard. She would have passed it entirely, would have walked straight to the front door and into the October night, except that the rosewood box was open, and Harold had told her about the box only once, years ago. In the quiet way he told her things he needed her to remember. "If that box is ever open without you, read everything inside before you leave." The box was open. The cards inside had been disturbed. She could see they had been moved, sorted through, handled. Someone had been in the box. Someone had been looking through 40 years of Harold's anniversary cards. She looked at the cards, and then she looked at the floor. Beneath the sideboard, half hidden, was an envelope. It must have fallen or been knocked aside. She could see the edge of it, the cream-colored corner against the dark floor. She bent down and picked it up. Harold's handwriting, his particular careful script, the one she had loved for 28 years. For Virginia, year 42, open only when you need to remember who you are. She stood for a moment with the envelope in her hands. Behind her, she could hear the table resuming the sound of conversation, returning the clink of glasses, Derek's laugh from the far end where Harold used to sit, the warm sound of a room that had already moved on. She put the envelope in her coat pocket. She walked out the front door into the October night. The air was cold and clear, the elm trees dark against the sky, the last of the light gone from the horizon. Behind her, the house glowed, every window lit, the sound of voices inside the anniversary dinner, continuing without the woman who had sat at every one of them for 28 years. She walked to her car. She got in. She closed the door. She sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she reached into her coat pocket and took out the envelope. She held it in both hands. Harold's writing on the front. Year 42, the year he had not lived to see. The anniversary dinner he had prepared for anyway, and the only way still available to him. She had not opened it yet. She would. She already knew it was going to tell her something she needed. But first she sat with the envelope in her hands and thought about Harold standing at the head of his table year after year tapping his glass. He would have said she could hear it as clearly as if he were in the seat beside her. 28 years ago, this woman agreed to sit beside me at every table. I intend to make every table worth sitting at. He had not missed a year. He was not missing this one either. She just hadn't found his chair yet. She sat in the car for 40 minutes. She did not turn on the engine. She did not turn on the radio. She sat in the dark at the end of the Elmwood driveway with the warm glow of the house in her rearview mirror and the October night pressing quietly against the windows, and she held the envelope in both hands without opening it. She was not ready yet. She needed a moment that was only hers, a moment between the table and whatever came next, a space in which she was neither performing composure for an audience nor collapsing into the privacy of what she actually felt. She sat in that space and let the evening be what it was, the elm trees, the cold, the sound of nothing, the particular quality of sitting alone after a room full of people who looked through you. Then she turned on the dome light. She opened the envelope. Harold's handwriting. She had known it for 28 years, the deliberate, slightly compressed script of a man who had taught himself to write carefully because he believed that words written by hand deserved the same precision as words spoken aloud. She had read this handwriting on birthday cards and grocery lists and the notes he left on the kitchen counter and the margins of books he thought she should read. She would know it anywhere. She would know it in the dark. The card was not what she expected. She had expected what he always wrote, the warm, specific, slightly formal tenderness that Harold brought to anniversary cards, the sentences that managed to be both restrained and completely open, that said, "I love you," in the language of a man who meant it as a plain fact rather than a performance. She had expected that. She had been prepared for that. What she found instead was a single paragraph, brief, direct, written in the tone he used when he was giving instructions, rather than expressing feeling, the tone of a man who had thought something through and arrived at the clearest possible way to say it. "Ginny, if you're reading this at the anniversary dinner and something feels wrong, go to Robert Chen. Take this card with you. He'll know what to do. He has been waiting for you to come. I am sorry. I couldn't be there to sit beside you. I made sure the next best thing would be. With all my love, as always, Harold." She read it twice. Then she sat with it in her lap and looked through the windshield at the elm trees and felt moving through her the specific and overwhelming sensation of being known, of being seen by someone so completely and so far in advance that they had prepared for your need before you understood you would have it. Harold had written this card knowing he might not be at the table. He had written it knowing that something might feel wrong. He had prepared for the exact evening she had just lived, and he had left her the next step in his own handwriting, sealed and waiting in a box he had told her to read before she left, if the box was ever open without her. He had been there all along. She just hadn't found him yet. She sat for another moment. Then she put the card carefully back in its envelope and put the envelope in her coat pocket and got out of the car. She went back inside for her reading glasses. That was what she said to the room when she opened the front door, quietly to no one in particular, in the matter-of-fact tone of a woman who has simply forgotten something and returned for it. Several people looked up. Derek from the far end of the table tracked her movement with the slight narrowing of a man recalculating whether he has fully concluded a transaction he believed was closed. She walked to the sideboard. The rosewood box was still there, still open, the cards still scattered across the surface, the way they had been left by someone who had gone through them quickly and without care. She looked at the cards now with the full attention she had not had time for earlier. 41 envelopes, each one cream-colored, each one sealed, each one with Harold's handwriting on the front in the same deliberate script as the card in her pocket. Year 1, Year 2, Year 3. She read them in sequence along the sideboard, the years accumulating under her eyes, the years of a marriage laid out in a row on a piece of furniture, in a room where someone had scattered them, searching for something valuable, and had not understood that they had already found it. Harold had made a card for every year. She had not known. He had never told her. He had been making them since their first anniversary and storing them in the rosewood box, and she had not known because Harold was the kind of man who built things for the long game without announcing the building, who prepared for futures he could not predict with the patient precision of someone who understood that love to last needed structure as well as feeling. She found year one near the back of the sideboard, slightly apart from the others, as if it had been the last one Derek had handled before losing interest. The envelope was older than the others, the cream slightly yellowed at the edges, the handwriting a younger version of itself, the same script, but with less compression, the hand of a man in his 40s who had not yet developed the economy of his later years. On the outside, below the year one notation, Harold had written, "My Ginny, if you never open another one of these, just know year one was already everything." She stood very still. She did not open it. She was not going to open it here, not in this room, not with the sound of Derek's conversation at the other end, and the wine glasses catching the chandelier light, and Pamela's voice describing her plans for the upstairs hallway. Year one deserved better than this room. Year one would have its moment when she could give it the right one. She placed it carefully back with the others. Then she picked up the rosewood box, both hands, the way you carry something that matters, and placed all 41 cards inside it, one by one in order. Year 1 through year 41, each in its place. She did it methodically and without hurry, the way Harold would have done it, the way a person handles things they understand the value of. She closed the lid. She put the box under her arm. She heard Derek's chair. He came around the table with the controlled urgency of a man who has processed what he is seeing and has decided to address it before it reaches the front door. He was halfway across the room when she turned. He said, "What is that?" She said, "Something Harold made for me." He said that box belonged to... She said, "To 42 years, Derek. And you wouldn't know anything about that." She said it quietly, without heat. The way you say something that is simply and completely true and does not require the room's agreement to remain true. Derek stopped. She walked to the door. She walked out for the second time that evening into the same October night, but carrying something she had not carried the first time. The box under her arm. 42 years of Harold's handwriting sealed and waiting. She went down the porch steps and along the front path to her car. At the edge of the path, she looked up the habit of a woman who pays attention, who notices things at the edges of rooms and windows, and she saw Cassie. The upstairs window, the young woman standing in the light of it, looking down. When their eyes met, Cassie raised one hand in a small wave. Not a social gesture, something more private than that. The wave of a person who has witnessed something and wants the person they witnessed to know they were seen. Virginia nodded. Cassie mouthed the words she had mouthed at the table earlier. "I'm sorry." Virginia looked at her for a moment, at this young woman who had done the one small, real thing available to her in that room, who had offered the one acknowledgement that cost something to give in that company. Then she put the box in the car and got in and drove away from the house on Elmwood for the second time that night. She thought about Harold in his garage workshop that first winter they were together. She had come downstairs late and found the light on and gone to look. He had been at the workbench with sandpaper and a piece of rosewood working by lamplight, and she had stood in the doorway and asked what he was making. He had looked up with the expression of a man who has been caught at something he is not ready to explain, but is not inclined to hide. He had said something for the long game. She had not asked further. She had trusted the sentence the way she had come to trust most of what Harold said as complete, even when it was brief. She understood it now. 42 years later, driving through the October dark with his rosewood box on the passenger seat beside her and his year 42 card in her coat pocket and Robert Chen's name in her hand, she understood exactly what he had been building in that garage at midnight. He had been building this. She arrived at Robert Chen's office at 8:25. She had not slept well. She had sat at her kitchen table until past midnight with the rosewood box in front of her and a cup of tea she had made and not drunk. And she had looked at the box and thought about Harold in his garage workshop with the sandpaper and the lamplight, and eventually she had gone to bed and lain in the particular stillness of a bed. that has had two people in it for a long time, and now has one, and she had waited for morning the way you wait for things you cannot accelerate. She had dressed carefully. Not formally, she was not performing for anyone, but with the deliberateness of a woman who understands that how you present yourself in important rooms is a form of respect for what those rooms might contain. Her good gray coat, the small pearl earrings Harold had given her on their 15th anniversary, the rosewood box in her bag, and the year 42 card in her coat pocket. The receptionist looked up when she came through the door. "Virginia said I don't have an appointment. Harold Hartwell sent me." The receptionist's expression shifted a small shift, barely perceptible, the shift of someone receiving information that changes the category of the situation. She said, "One moment, please." She picked up the phone and spoke quietly into it. Robert Chen came out in 60 seconds. He was a compact man with the unhurried quality of someone who has practiced being unhurried for long enough that it has become his natural state. He looked at Virginia in the way of a man who has been expecting something without knowing exactly what form it would take and has just seen it walk through his door. He said, "Mrs. Hartwell, please come in." His office was the kind of room that accumulates character over decades rather than acquiring it by design. Law books on every wall, the shelves slightly overcrowded a desk that had held 50 years of serious work and showed it in the particular way good furniture shows used not as damage but as evidence of purpose. The window behind the desk looked out over a courtyard where an oak tree was in its full October color, and the light that came through was the same honest October light Harold had always called the truest light of the year. Virginia sat in the chair across from the desk and set her bag on the floor beside her. Robert sat across from her and folded his hands and looked at her with the steady attention of a man who knows how to listen and is preparing to do so. She told him about the anniversary dinner. She told him about the name card at the far end of the table and Derek's tribute that did not say her name, and Pamela describing the reimagining of the house with the confidence of someone already in possession. She told him about the coat and what Derek had said when he handed it to her and the 12 people who had watched. She told him about the rosewood box and the card on the floor and the 41 years of sealed envelopes. She took the year 42 card from her pocket and placed it on the desk between them. Robert picked it up. He read it. He was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then he set the card down with the careful placement of a man handling something he understands the significance of. "He said Derek called me 2 weeks before the dinner." Virginia waited. "Robert said he told me the family was handling probate internally, that they had retained their own counsel, and that my services were no longer required for the estate administration. He said Harold had expressed this preference in the final months." She said Harold would never have said that. Robert said, "I know. Harold was one of my oldest clients and one of my closest friends. I found the communication unusual from the first sentence. But Derek presented what appeared to be authorization paperwork, signed formatted correctly referencing specific case numbers. I flagged it with my own records immediately. What I found when I reviewed the originals was..." He paused. He said, "I set that aside for now. There is something more important to address first." He stood from the desk and went to the filing cabinet along the left wall, the third drawer. He moved through the files with the unhesitating motion of a man who knows exactly where everything is and has always known, and he withdrew a sealed envelope. He set it on the desk in front of Virginia, Harold's handwriting on the front. The same script as the year 42 carved the same deliberate compression of his later years. The words written on the envelope were brief, to be opened in the presence of Virginia Hartwell only. "Robert said he gave me this 6 months before he died. He sat in that chair, the one you're sitting in now, and he placed it on the desk and told me to keep it in the file and wait." Virginia said, "Did he tell you what was in it?" Robert said, "I asked him. He said it was insurance." He paused, and in the pause she could hear Harold's voice, the particular dry precision of it, the way he said important things as simply as possible. Robert said, "He said insurance, Robert. Not for me, for her." Virginia looked at the envelope on the desk between them, at Harold's handwriting, at the sealed edge that had held its secret for 6 months of his knowing and however many years of his planning before that, because Harold did not prepare things 6 months in advance. Harold prepared things the way he built the rosewood box for the long game from the first winter before he could have known exactly what he was preparing for. She thought about sitting beside him years ago at another attorney's office signing papers for the house, and his hand finding hers under the table. "Legal things feel cold," he had said. "But I always think about you when I'm in these rooms." "Keeps it human," she said. "Open it." Robert opened the envelope. Inside 2 pages, handwritten on Harold's personal stationery, the kind he used for correspondence he considered important, not his professional letterhead, but the cream-colored pages with the small H monogram in the upper corner. The handwriting was consistent throughout, unhurried, the writing of a man who had known what he wanted to say and had taken the time to say it precisely. At the bottom of the second page, a notary seal, a date, a signature Virginia recognized as Harold's, and one she did not recognize, which would be the notary's. Robert read it silently, turning from the first page to the second, with the still focused attention of a man reading something in his professional capacity, and also underneath that reading something written by a man he had known for 30 years and was encountering again in this form for the first time. He reached the bottom of the second page. His expression did not change, but his hand went still, the hand holding the pages suspended slightly above the desk surface, no longer moving. He said, "Virginia!" His voice was quiet, the particular quiet of a man who has just read something that has confirmed a thing he suspected and is taking a moment before he speaks further. He said, "I think you should sit down." She said, "I am sitting down, Robert." He looked up from the page. A small, involuntary thing moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but something in that register, something that was Harold's doing rather than his own. He said, "Yes, you are." He turned the second page and placed it on the desk facing her, and he indicated the paragraph near the top, with the bold heading above it. The paragraph, she could see, was set apart from the rest of the document, formatted differently given its own space on the page, as if Harold had understood that this particular provision deserved room to exist without the surrounding language pressing in on it. She read it. Then she looked up slowly. She said, "He wrote this specifically about the anniversary dinner." Robert said, "Specifically about any family gathering where you might be present." He named the anniversary dinner by tradition. He described it as the dinner Harold Hartwell initiated in the first year of his marriage to Virginia and maintained without interruption. His language was very precise. He looked at her across the desk. He said Harold was always very precise. She looked back at the paragraph, at Harold's handwriting, deliberate and compressed and entirely itself, at the notary seal at the bottom of the page and the date 6 months before he died, when he had sat in this office and placed this envelope on this desk and told Robert Chen it was insurance. Not for me, for her. She had sat at the far end of her husband's anniversary table 12 hours ago, and a man who was no longer living had been in this office 6 months before, that making sure she would not have to stay there. She put her hands flat on the desk and breathed. Robert said, "Should I continue?" She said, "Yes, tell me everything." Robert read the addendum aloud. He read it the way he read everything that mattered, without performance, without editorial emphasis, in the steady, unhurried voice of a man who has spent 50 years understanding that the most important thing a legal document requires is to be heard clearly. Virginia sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap and listened the way she had listened to Harold for 28 years completely, without interrupting, trusting that the full meaning would arrive, if she gave it the space to. The first page established the addendum's standing. Robert had filed it independently, not as an attachment to the primary will, but as a standalone document with the county clerk's office dated and notarized, referencing the primary will by case number, but existing outside of it. Harold had done this deliberately, Robert explained, pausing briefly between the formal language and his own commentary. The standalone filing meant that the addendum's legal authority did not depend on the primary will's administration. It could not be suppressed by controlling access to the estate file. It could not be made to disappear by excluding the attorney who held it. Harold had understood 6 months before he died that someone might try to do exactly that. Robert turned to the second page. He said this is the section he named himself. He read the heading, the dignity clause. The words sat in the quiet of the wood-paneled office with the weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be said aloud. Robert read the clause language in full, his voice steady and precise. Should any heir by deliberate act or omission publicly demean, exclude, or remove the surviving spouse from any designated family gathering, as defined herein, that heir's portion of the estate shall be forfeited in full and transferred to the surviving spouse within 30 days of documented occurrence. He paused, then he continued. The document defined designated family gathering with the specific careful language of a man who had anticipated that the definition would matter. It included any gathering hosted at the Hartwell family residence to which family members are invited. It included any gathering held in the name of Harold Hartwell's memory or legacy, and it included named explicitly the annual anniversary dinner of Harold and Virginia Hartwell, which shall continue as a family tradition for as long as the surviving spouse lives. Virginia was still. She looked at the page Robert was holding and thought about Harold sitting in this chair, the chair she was sitting in now, across from this desk with this document in front of him. She thought about him reading these words back to himself before he signed them the way he read everything he wrote, checking the precision of it, making sure it said exactly what he meant and nothing that could be made to mean something else. She thought about the night before a difficult family holiday years ago, when she had been quieter than usual in the evening, and Harold had come to find her in the kitchen and had stood beside her at the counter and said without preamble in the way he said the most important things, whatever happens tomorrow, "Ginny, you're the one I chose. Nothing that happens at that table changes that. Nothing ever could." She had held onto those words through every difficult table since. He had been building the legal version of them at the same time. Robert said Derek's act last evening, handing you your coat and directing you to leave in front of 12 witnesses, meets the definition of deliberate exclusion from a designated family gathering. The anniversary dinner is named in the clause. The act was public. The witnesses are present and identifiable. He set the page down. He said, "And one of them called my office this morning." Virginia looked up. Robert reached to the corner of his desk and turned a single page to face her. A handwritten statement on plain paper, the handwriting clear and young and deliberate, the writing of someone who had chosen each word carefully and wanted them to be legible. Cassie Cross. The statement described the evening in full. The name card at the far end of the table. Derek's tribute that did not say Virginia's name. Pamela's announcement about reimagining the house, the coat, the words, the 12 people at the table. Cassie had written it the way Virginia remembered her sitting at the table, paying attention, watching rather than performing, understanding what she was witnessing. At the bottom she had written, "I am willing to provide this statement in any legal proceeding that requires it. I was there. I saw everything." "Virginia said she called you this morning," Robert said before 8 o'clock. "She said she had been awake since midnight deciding whether to do it. She said she decided that not doing it would make her complicit in something her grandfather would have been ashamed of." Virginia looked at the statement for a moment, at Cassie's handwriting, at the words, "I was there. I saw everything." She thought about the upstairs window, the small wave. "I'm sorry," mouthed through the glass. She had not been alone in that room after all. She had not seen it at the time. She saw it now. Robert said, "There is one more thing Harold anticipated that I want you to understand, because it speaks to how carefully he thought this through." He indicated a paragraph lower on the second page, a provision Virginia had not yet read in full. Should the estate attorney be excluded from any family gathering or probate proceeding without cause, this addendum is to be treated as a stand-alone document under independent legal authority, with full standing to be presented directly to the court without estate executor approval. Virginia said he knew Derek would try to remove you. Robert said he told me when he gave me the envelope that there might be an attempt to manage the process in a way that kept me out of it. He said he had made sure that would not matter. I didn't understand the full mechanism until I read this document this morning alongside yours. He set the page down and folded his hands. He said he called it the dignity clause. He told me his voice carried something now. Not professional distance, but the particular weight of a man quoting a friend he has lost. He said, "I've watched how some men treat the women they're supposed to protect, Robert. I'm not leaving Virginia to the mercy of that." The room was quiet. Virginia looked at the oak tree through the window, the October light on its leaves, the same honest light Harold had always named. She said, "Did you know what was in this when he gave it to you?" Robert was quiet for a moment. A long pause, the pause of a man giving a question the full honesty it deserved. "He said he told me the title. That was enough for me to keep it safe." Virginia nodded. Then Robert reached into the desk drawer and produced a small USB drive. He plugged it into the laptop on the corner of the desk and turned the screen toward her without comment, the way you present something that needs no introduction. The file was dated 6 months before Harold died. A Thursday afternoon, the timestamp read, she could picture it. Harold driving here on a Thursday afternoon and sitting in this chair and asking Robert to record this and keep it with the envelope, and Robert doing it because Harold asked him to, and neither of them saying more about it than was necessary. Robert pressed play. Harold's face filled the screen. He was sitting in this same chair in this same room with the same oak tree visible through the window behind him. He looked tired. The tiredness of the last year was in his face, in the slight compression of it, the way illness rearranges a face over time. But his eyes were steady, certain, the eyes she had looked into 10,000 times and had never stopped finding something new in. He looked directly at the camera. He said, "Hi, Jenny," his voice. After everything, the anniversary dinner and the name card and the coat and the dark driveway and the rosewood box and the 41 sealed years of it, his voice in this room steady and warm and entirely himself. He said, "If you're watching this, you already know what happened. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to stop it. I should have had a harder conversation with Derek years ago, and I didn't, and I'm sorry for that too. I kept hoping things would change on their own. They didn't. Some things require more than hope." He paused. He looked at the camera at her with the expression she recognized as his most direct, the expression he wore when he was saying something he had thought about for a long time and was finally saying plainly. He said, "So I did the next best thing. I made sure the law would say what I should have said louder while I was still in the room. I made sure you would have a place at the table, the real place, the right place, the one you earned and deserved every single year, even after I wasn't there to give it to you myself." He said, "The rosewood box has everything I couldn't say at the right moment. Open them when you're ready, not all at once, 1 year at a time if you want. I wrote them so you'd have something of me for every anniversary that comes after. I didn't want you to be alone at those tables." He was quiet for a moment. The oak tree moved slightly behind him in whatever wind had been blowing through that Thursday afternoon 6 months before his death. He said, "You were always the one I chose, Ginny. I just wanted to make sure it was on the record." The video ended. The room held the silence of it, that particular silence that follows the voice of someone who is no longer living. The silence that is both empty and full at once. Robert reached over quietly and closed the laptop. Virginia sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the closed screen for a long moment. She did not cry, or rather she felt the thing that crying comes from the deep, complete pressure of it, but she held it the way she had held herself at the table the night before. Not because she was suppressing it, but because some moments feel too large for tears to be adequate to them. Harold had done this. He had sat in this chair on a Thursday afternoon with his tired face and his steady eyes, and he had looked into a camera and talked to her specifically, to the future version of her, sitting in this office with this document and this rosewood box, and he had said, "I made sure the law would say what I should have said, louder." 42 years. 42 years of a man building something for the long game, from the first winter, from a garage workshop at midnight, from a filing cabinet in his oldest friend's office, from a sealed envelope that had waited 6 months for her to walk through a door she had not known she needed to walk through. She said, "What happens now, Robert?" Robert Chen uncapped his pen. The certified letter arrived at Derek's address at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning. He had been at his kitchen table with his coffee and his phone moving through emails with the efficient half-attention of a man whose morning routine has not yet registered that the day is going to be different from other days. The knock at the door was the particular knock of a postal carrier requiring a signature, and he signed without looking at the return address, and he carried the envelope to the table and set it beside his coffee and opened it with the letter opener he kept in the drawer. He read it once. Then he set it down and looked at it. Then he picked it up and read it again. The language was Robert Chen's precise, unhurried, the prose of a man who chooses words the way a surgeon chooses instruments for their specific function, rather than their impression. The letter named the dignity clause. It named the anniversary dinner. It named Derek Hartwell by full name and described in plain declarative sentences the act of handing Virginia her coat and directing her to leave in front of 12 witnesses as a documented breach of the clause's provisions. It cited the independent county filing number. It stated the legal consequence forfeiture of Derek's full portion of the estate transfer to Virginia within 30 days, and it invited Derek to contact Robert Chen's office to discuss the process. It did not invite Derek to contest the facts. Derek called Pamela. The conversation was short, and from the sound of it, not the first difficult conversation they had shared since the anniversary dinner. He told her what the letter said. There was a silence on her end. Then her voice several registers higher than her usual controlled register, saying something about the box, about the cards, about how she had told him not to. He called Virginia next. Virginia looked at her phone and set it face down on the kitchen table and went to make her second cup of coffee of the morning. Robert Chen's car was in the driveway when Derek arrived. He sat in his own car for a moment, looking at it, the silver sedan, older but well-maintained, parked with the deliberate straightness of a man who parks carefully, and then he got out and knocked at the front door of the house that had been his father's house and was now pending the resolution of a clause Harold had written 6 months before his death, a more complicated question than Derek had understood it to be 48 hours ago. Virginia opened the door. She said, "Come in." The living room was as it had always been. Harold's house in its bones, the furniture arranged the way it had been arranged for years, the photographs on the walls, the rosewood box on the side table beside the window where Virginia had placed it when she came home 2 nights ago. Robert was seated in the armchair to the right of the fireplace, his briefcase open on the low table beside him, the addendum document in a folder on top. Derek sat on the sofa. He said, "Virginia." He said it in the tone of a man who has prepared an approach and is beginning it. He said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding about what happened at the dinner. I was trying to the evening was—" Robert placed the dignity clause on the table between them. He set it down with the quiet, deliberate placement of a man who has ended this particular category of conversation before and knows exactly how. He said, "This isn't a misunderstanding, Derek. This is a documented breach. The clause names the act. The act occurred. 12 people witnessed it. One of those witnesses has already provided a written statement." Derek looked at the document, at the bold heading, at his father's handwriting visible in the portions Robert had annotated. He said, "My father couldn't have anticipated." He stopped, because the front door had opened. Pamela came in without knocking, which was consistent with how Pamela had always moved through this house with the proprietary ease of someone who had decided in advance that the space belonged to her. She was dressed well, as she always was, her coat still on her bag over her arm. She looked at Robert. She looked at the document on the table. She looked at the rosewood box on the side table. Then she looked at Derek. Her face did something that Virginia watched with the careful attention she brought to everything. It moved from the composed surface Pamela wore publicly to something colder and more specific underneath the expression of a woman who has calculated a situation and found the number worse than expected. She said, "What exactly did you say to him?" Derek said, "I told him it was a misunderstanding." Pamela said, "I told you not to touch that box. I told you the night of the dinner. I said leave it." Derek said, "You were going through it too." The words landed in the room with the specific quality of an admission made in the heat of deflection, said too quickly before the speaker has fully thought through what saying it reveals. Robert said without looking up from the folder he was consulting, "The box is a personal gift to Virginia. It is not an estate asset. Its removal from the property or the disturbance of its contents is also documented as of the night of the dinner." Pamela turned to look at him. Robert continued, his tone unchanged. "The contents of the rosewood box are Harold's anniversary correspondence to Virginia. Personal gifts made over a period of 42 years. There is no legal mechanism by which they become estate property. A silence. Pamela set her bag on the chair nearest the door with the motion of a woman deciding to stay longer than she had planned. She said, "I wasn't looking for the cards." Robert said, "I know." She looked at him. Something in the precision of his response had caught her. "He said you were looking for a deed to the vacation property on the lake that you believed Harold had promised you. You believed it might have been stored in the box." Pamela said nothing. Robert said Harold made no such deed. He made no such promise. I have his complete property records. There is no lake property document because there is no lake property promise. I need you to understand that clearly and completely, because any legal action based on the existence of that promise would require you to produce evidence of it, and there is none because it did not occur. The room was very still. Pamela looked at the table, at the dignity clause, at Cassie's written statement which Robert had placed beside it, the young woman's clear handwriting, the unambiguous account of Tuesday's events, the words "I was there" at the bottom in Cassie's hand. Pamela looked at the statement for a long moment. Something moved in her face, something that was not remorse exactly, but was perhaps the precursor to it, the moment when a person stops calculating and starts actually seeing what they have done. She said to no one in particular she called him. Virginia did not answer. While Derek and Pamela continued their exchange, which had descended, as Virginia had expected it would, into the particular circular argument of two people trying to establish which of them was less responsible for a shared mistake, Virginia reached for the rosewood box. She opened it quietly. She did not take out all the cards. She took out one. Year 18. She had been married to Harold for 18 years. At year 18, the year their younger dog had died, and they had spent a Saturday in the backyard together doing nothing much. Just being in the garden because neither of them had felt like being inside. And at some point in the late afternoon, Harold had come into the kitchen while she was making tea and had taken her hand and turned her toward him and danced with her very slowly in the kitchen with no music playing. She had said, "There's no music." He had said, "You never need a reason to dance with me, just a kitchen and a little patience." She opened the year 18 card and read it. She read it quietly with the particular stillness of a person reading something meant only for them in a room full of noise that is not reaching them. When she finished, she folded the card along its crease and held it. The room had gone quieter. Derek and Pamela had reached the exhausted plateau of an argument that has run out of new directions and is now repeating itself. Robert was looking at Virginia with the patient attention of a man waiting for the moment he had been told would come. Virginia looked up. She said he had a lot to say. He just said it to me. The room went still. Derek looked at her. She thought she saw very briefly something move in his face that was not the controlled expression he usually wore, something younger and less certain, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. He said, "What does she get?" He said it to Robert, which was where he had been directing everything. But Robert turned and looked at Virginia with the quiet deliberateness of a man indicating that this question has a different address. Virginia had not spoken once in this meeting until the line about the cards. She had sat with her hands in her lap and the year 18 card folded between her fingers, and she had let Robert and the documents and Harold's preparation do the work that Harold had built them to do. She spoke now. She said, "I haven't decided yet." Derek looked at her. Robert reached into his briefcase and placed one more document on the table. He said it precisely without flourish. He said, "This is the county clerk's independent filing. The recording date is public record. This document has been accessible to any member of the public who requested it since the date Harold filed it." He looked at Derek steadily. He said, "You can argue with me all day, Derek, but you can't argue with Harold." He anticipated this conversation. He prepared for it. He was a more careful man than you ever gave him credit for. Derek looked at the county filing, at the recording date, at his father's name in the header. He said nothing. The rosewood box sat on the side table beside the window, closed now 41 sealed years, and one open card inside it, watching the room with the patient permanence of something built for the long game by a man who had understood from the first winter exactly what he was building it for. 3 days later, Derek and Pamela arrived with their attorney. Her name was Linda Marsh. She was a compact, precise woman in her 50s with the kind of professional composure that comes not from confidence alone, but from competence, the specific hard-won composure of someone who has walked into difficult rooms for 20 years and has learned to read them accurately within 60 seconds of entering. She came in behind Derek and Pamela set her briefcase on the table and opened it with the efficient motion of someone who has already done the most important work and is here to conclude what the work requires. She had reviewed the dignity clause before arriving. Virginia could tell from the quality of her expression not resigned exactly, but settled the expression of a professional who has assessed the situation and arrived at the only honest position available to her. Her face told the story before she spoke a word. The settlement meeting was in Harold's living room. Virginia had arranged the chairs herself that morning with the particular care she brought to things that mattered: the 2 chairs on one side of the low table for Derek and Pamela, the chair for Linda beside them, and her own chair opposite alone on her side of the table. The rosewood box sat on the table between them where Virginia had placed it when she came downstairs, not as a theatrical gesture, as a fact. It was part of this story, and it belonged in this room. Robert was in the armchair to the side present as counsel and as witness, his folder open on his knee. Linda said, "I'll speak plainly because I think that serves everyone here." She placed her copy of the dignity clause on the table. She had tabbed the relevant sections in yellow. She said the clause is legally sound. The county filing gives it independent standing outside the primary estate administration. The witness statement is clear and unambiguous. And the act that triggered it, Derek said it in front of 12 people in a room where every person present can be named and contacted. There is no viable challenge. Derek said there must be some. Linda said Derek. She said it the way a professional says a client's name when they need the client to stop talking. There isn't. The room absorbed this. Linda continued, Derek's full share of the estate is forfeited under the clause's terms. Pamela's share is reduced by 40% in recognition of her role in disturbing and scattering property that has been established as a personal gift to Virginia, specifically the contents and physical structure of the rosewood box. Pamela looked at the table. Linda said Virginia is offered Derek's forfeited share in full and permanent transfer of the title to this property. She slid the forfeiture agreement across the table to Robert. Robert reviewed it. He nodded once. The room waited. Virginia had been sitting with her hands in her lap throughout in the posture she had brought to every difficult room, still upright, her attention complete. She had thought about Harold the night before, about something he had said to her years ago after a difficult mediation meeting they had attended together sitting in the car, after with the tension of the room still around them. He had taken her hand and said, "In every negotiation, Ginny be the calmest person in the room. They'll always mistake quiet for weakness. They'll always be wrong." She was the calmest person in this room. She thought the calmest person in every room this week. Not because she was not feeling things, she was feeling everything in the deep, continuous way she had been feeling things since the October night. She had sat in the dark car with Harold's handwriting in her hands, but because she had learned over 42 years, beside a man who thought carefully, that clarity required stillness, and she intended to be clear. She said, "I have one additional request." Linda looked up from her notes. Robert looked at her with the expression of a man who had been told something like this might come and was interested to see the form it took. Virginia said the anniversary dinner. She said Harold started it 28 years ago. He named it a family tradition in the dignity clause. I want it to continue but reimagined. Once a year at this house hosted by me for widows in the community who have nowhere to go on their anniversaries. Women who are alone on dates that used to mean something. Harold would have wanted that. He started the dinner because he believed that the years of a good marriage deserved to be counted. I think all of them do. The room was quiet. Derek was looking at her with an expression she had not expected. Not anger, not calculation, but something that had come loose in him. The expression of a man who has prepared for one kind of conversation and has found himself in a different one entirely. He had expected financial demands. He had expected the language of victory and compensation. He had not expected this. Linda wrote it into the settlement amendment without comment. The quiet scratch of her pen was the only sound in the room for a moment. Then she turned the forfeiture agreement to face Derek. She placed a pen beside it. Derek looked at the document, at his father's name in the heading, at the clause language his father had written 6 months before his death, in a chair in Robert Chen's office, on a Thursday afternoon, in the full knowledge of what he was doing and why. His hand hesitated for 1 full second above the signature line. Then he signed. Virginia watched his hand move and thought about Harold's, about the deliberate way Harold had written, the care he took with signatures, the way he read every document fully before he signed it, the way he had taught her to do the same. She thought about what it had cost Harold in the last year of his life to sit in Robert's office and prepare for a future he would not be in, to think about the anniversary dinner without him, to build the legal architecture of a tradition he could not attend. He had done it anyway. He had done it because she would be there after he was not. Pamela signed where Linda indicated. Her signature was smaller than usual, compressed the handwriting of someone who has been reduced in some way they have not yet fully processed. Linda gathered the documents. She aligned them, replaced them in her briefcase, closed the clasp. She stood. She moved toward the door. She passed Virginia on the way. She stopped. She said it quietly, not for the room, but for Virginia specifically. Your husband was a very thoughtful man. Virginia said 42 years of evidence. Linda Marsh allowed herself a small, genuine thing that was almost a smile. Then she went out. Derek followed without speaking. Pamela was last. She reached the door and paused. The pause of a woman who is prepared to leave and has found that her feet have not caught up with the decision. She turned back. She said, "I don't expect you to forgive us." She said it without the careful social management she usually brought to difficult sentences. It was plain. It was Virginia thought the most honest thing Pamela had said in this house in 28 years. Virginia looked at her. She said, "I don't forgive or hold grudges, Pamela. I just remember clearly." Pamela looked at her for a moment. Then she went out and the front door closed behind her and the house was quiet, in the particular way it had been quiet for 3 days. Not the heavy, directionless quiet of grief, but the quiet of a place that has come through something and knows what it is now. Robert stayed for tea. Virginia made it the way Harold had always made it properly, with the good pot, the one they had bought in their 3rd year and used ever since. She brought 2 cups to the kitchen table and sat across from Robert, and they drank it without rushing. After a while, Robert reached into his briefcase one final time. He placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them. Not a legal document. Notebook paper lined Harold's handwriting in the particular informal version he used for personal notes rather than correspondence, slightly looser, slightly faster, but still deliberate. Robert said he gave me this with the envelope. He said it belonged with the other materials but wasn't part of the legal instrument. Virginia unfolded it. It was Harold's notes for the anniversary dinner. A guest list format, blank lines where the names would go, but the structure of it clear. A suggested menu in his handwriting. And at the bottom, underlined once, the toast. His exact words written out in full, the words he had said every year for 28 years, with a glass raised at the head of his table. She read them. Robert said he wanted the dinner to continue. He just knew it would need a new purpose. Virginia folded the paper carefully and held it in both hands. She thought about 42 sealed envelopes in the rosewood box on the table in the other room, about year 1 and what Harold had written on the outside. If you never open another one of these, just know year 1 was already everything. She thought about all the years still to be opened, one at a time when she was ready, each one a year of Harold's voice patient and present and entirely himself, waiting for her in the only form still available to him. She reached up and touched the chain at her collar, the brass key small and warm. It stays with her. It always would. The house was quiet in the way it had been quiet before all of this, not the weighted quiet of loss or the taut quiet of conflict, but the ordinary quiet of a Tuesday morning with tea on the table and light coming through the kitchen window at the angle it always came through in October, the honest light Harold had always named. Virginia sat at the kitchen table with the rosewood box in front of her and opened the lid. 42 envelopes. She had counted them the night she brought the box home, sitting on the edge of the bed, in the lamplight, touching each one without opening it, feeling the slight variations in thickness and age, the older ones yellowed at the edges, the newer ones still crisp, all of them sealed, all of them in Harold's handwriting, all of them waiting with the patient certainty of things that were made to last. She had decided sometime in the 3 days since the settlement meeting that she would not rush them, that rushing them would be a way of not honoring what they were 42 years of a man's attention given 1 year at a time, stored and waiting with the same care he brought to everything that mattered to him. You did not consume that in an afternoon. You lived alongside it the way you had lived alongside the man himself. 1 card per week, 1 year at a time in order. She began with year 1. She had already seen the outside My Ginny. If you never open another one of these, just know, year 1 was already everything. She opened the card slowly, the way you open something you have been anticipating for a long time and want to receive fully. Harold at his youngest in this collection. The handwriting looser, the sentences longer, the slightly unguarded quality of a man who had not yet developed the economy of his later years and was still finding out what he wanted to say and how to say it. He had written about the dinner, their first anniversary dinner, just the two of them at the table with candles and the good dishes, and about something she had said that evening that he could not now remember exactly, but had felt at the time like the truest thing he had heard in years. He had written, "Whatever comes, I want you to know that I entered this with my whole self. No reservations, no exit plan. Just you and whatever the years bring." She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it back in its envelope and set it to the left of the box, the beginning of a line that would grow week by week. The cards were all different. She had expected a consistency of tone, Harold's characteristic precision, his deliberate tenderness, and she found it, but the variations within it surprised her. Some cards were long, dense, with the specific observations of a man who had been paying close attention all year and had saved it up for this one document. Some were brief. Year 7 was a single line. "Still the best decision I ever made." She sat with that one for a long time, in the particular way you sit, with something simple that contains more than its simplicity suggests. Year 22 was the one that stopped her completely. She had not told Harold in the year of year 22 how hard it had been. His first marriage had finally ended in a way that required things of him, legal things, financial things, the painful administrative process of a conclusion that had been coming for years, but still arrived with its own specific weight. She had stood beside him through all of it without complaint and without making her own difficulty visible, because she had understood, or thought she had, that it was his difficulty to carry, and her role was to be steady beside it. She had not known he had seen her doing that. The year 22 card read, "I know this year was harder than you let on. You never said so. You were steady the entire time, not because you had to be, but because you chose to be. That meant everything to me, more than I know how to say in a card. But I'm trying." She set it down on the table and pressed her hands flat on the surface and breathed. He had seen her. He had been seeing her all along, every year, and he had been writing it down not for anyone else, not as record-keeping in the practical sense, but as the most personal form of witness she had ever encountered. He had been documenting their marriage the way a careful person documents something they do not want to lose year by year in the private language of two people who had spent a long time learning to understand each other. She was the only reader he had ever intended. Year 38 was thicker than the others. She noticed it when she lifted it from the box, the slight additional weight, the envelope not quite lying flat. She opened it and found the card inside, and pressed between the card and the envelope's back a small wildflower. Dried flat, the color faded to a pale version of what it had been, the stem still intact. No note, no explanation, just the flower and his name signed below the card's message. She held the dried flower in her palm and thought about the hill behind the house, the slope that ran up to the tree line at the back of the property, the place they had walked on Sunday mornings in good weather, the place where wildflowers came up in late summer every year in the particular colors of that hillside. He had gone up there and picked one and pressed it and placed it in an envelope and sealed it and put it in the box. No explanation, because she would know. Because after 38 years, she would know exactly where it was from and what that meant, and an explanation would only diminish it. She set the flower gently beside year 38's envelope and sat with the understanding that 42 years of a man's love expressed in this form was something she would be discovering for the rest of her life in exactly the way he had intended, slowly, specifically, 1 year at a time. Cassie came on a Thursday afternoon. She arrived with flowers, not a large arrangement, not something formal, but a small bunch of the kind of flowers you pick yourself from a market when you are trying to say something. And flowers are the truest available language. She had a handwritten note in an envelope, not from her mother, from herself alone in her own handwriting, taking her own responsibility for what she had witnessed and what she had done about it. Virginia put the flowers in a vase and made tea, and they sat in the living room, the older woman and the younger one, with the easy, slightly careful quality of two people who do not know each other well, but have been through something together that creates its own kind of closeness. At some point, Virginia went to the kitchen table and came back with year 1. She did not open it. She held it out to Cassie, just the envelope, just the outside, with Harold's young handwriting and the notation and the line he had written on the front. Cassie read it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He wrote this before he knew any of what would happen." Virginia said he wrote all of them before he knew. That was the point. Cassie looked at the envelope for a moment longer. Then she handed it back carefully with both hands, the way young people handle things they understand are precious. That evening, Virginia sat at the kitchen table with a stack of blank cards and a pen. She was not writing to Harold. She had his words to read 1 week at a time for 42 weeks and beyond. She did not need to write back, or rather what she needed to write back she would carry in herself, in the private ongoing conversation of a widow with a man she had not stopped talking to and did not intend to stop. She was writing to the women who would come to the anniversary dinner. Not formal letters, not organizational correspondence. Cards like his, the personal kind addressed to each woman by name, acknowledging the specific year she was marking and the specific loss she was carrying to a table where she would not have to carry it alone. She wrote until the lamp was the only light in the kitchen. Later, she called Robert. He answered on the second ring, as he always seemed, to the unhurried answer of a man who keeps his phone nearby and believes that a ringing phone deserves a response. She said, "He didn't just leave me his estate, Robert. He left me his whole heart 1 year at a time." Robert said he told me once that he had been looking for the right person to leave things to for most of his life. He said he knew when he found you because he wanted to give you more than he had. She held the phone and looked at the rosewood box on the table. She said, "I think he succeeded." Before she went to bed, she opened the box one more time. The cards were all in order now. Year 1 through year 42. The opened ones in a neat line to the left. At the back of the box beneath the others, slightly apart, she had found it on the second day, recognized it immediately from the way Harold had placed it, turned face down with the deliberateness of a man setting something aside for the right moment rather than hiding it. Year 43. "For the year after I'm gone, read it whenever you're ready." She placed her hand over it. She felt the envelope beneath her palm, the slight thickness of it, the sealed edge, the weight of whatever Harold had written in advance for an anniversary he had known he would not see. She was not afraid of it. She had not been afraid of anything Harold had left her. Everything he had left her had been made with love and precision and the deep knowledge of who she was and what she would need, and year 43 would be no different. She was simply saving it. She closed the lid of the rosewood box. She turned off the kitchen light. She went upstairs in the quiet house. Her house, the house Harold had made legally and completely and irrevocably hers. The house where the anniversary dinner would happen every year from now on, with new women at the table, and Harold's toast read aloud, and the good dishes out, and all the years of a good marriage counted and honored, and she went to bed. In the morning she would open year 2,